The continued story of Taran, the assistant pig-keeper. I'm glad you've stayed to listen. Now sit round, as Papa Bear reads a story. Chapter 14. The End of Summer. It was near dawn. The fire in the hearth had long since burned out. Taran rose silently. He had slept only fitfully, his head crowded with so many thoughts he could not sort one from another. Fluter's cry of astonishment, Gurgie's joyful yelps, Craddock's embrace of welcome to a son he had scarcely seen, and Taran's bewildered embrace to a father he had never known. There had been harp playing and singing. Fluter had never been in better voice or spirits, and the herdsman's cottage had surely never rung with so much merriment. Yet Taran and Craddock had been more quiet than gay, as if striving to sense each other's mind and heart. At last, all had slept. Taran stepped to the door. The sheep were silent in their fold. The mountain air was chill. Dew glistened, a net of cold silver on the sparse pasture, and the stones twinkled like stars fallen to earth. Taran shivered and drew his cloak about him. He stood a while in the doorway before he sensed he was not alone. Fluter had moved to join him. "Couldn't sleep, huh?" Fluter said cheerily. "Neither could I. Too excited. Didn't close my eyes for 3 winks. Ah, yes, well, perhaps a few more than that. Great Beelin, but it's been a day and a half. It's not everyone who finds their long-lost father sitting out in the middle of nowhere. Taran, my friend, your search is ended, and ended well. We're spared a journey to the Lake of Lunette. I don't mind telling you I'm just as pleased. Now we must set our plans. I say we should ride north to the Fairfolk realm, and get hold of good old Dolly. Then on to my kingdom for some feasting and revelry. And I suppose you'll want to sail to Mona and tell Elodie the good news. So be it. Now your quest is over, you're free as a bird." "Free as the caged eagle that Morda would have made me," Taran cried. "This valley will destroy Craddock if he stays alone even a little longer. His burden is too great." "I honor him for trying to bear it. Indeed, I honor him for that, and nothing else. His deeds cost my mother her life and nearly cost me mine. Can any son love such a father? Yet as long as Craddock lives, I am bound to him by ties of blood, if truly his blood runs in my veins." "If?" replied Fluter. He frowned and looked closely at Taran. "You say 'if,' as though you doubted." "Craddock speaks truth when he says he is my father," Taran answered. "It is I who do not believe him." "How's that again?" asked Fluter. "You know he's your father and doubt it at the same time? Now you're really baffling me." "Fluter, can you not see?" Taran spoke slowly and painfully. "I don't believe him, because I don't want to believe him. In my heart, secretly, I had always dreamed, even as a child, that I might be of noble lineage." Fluter nodded. "Yes, I take your meaning," he sighed. "Alas, there's no choosing one's kinsman." "Now," Taran said, "my dream is no more than a dream, and I must give it up." "His tale rings true," answered the bard. "But if there is doubt in your heart, what shall you do?" "Ah, that rascal Caw, if he were only here, we could send him with word to Dulbin, but I doubt he'll find us in this dreary wasteland." "Wasteland?" said the voice of Craddock. The herdsman stood in the doorway. Taran quickly turned, ashamed of his own words, and wondering how many of them Craddock had overheard. But if the man had been there longer than a moment, he gave no sign of it. Instead, his weather-beaten face smiled as he hobbled to the companions, Gurgie following behind. "Wasteland you see it now," Craddock said, "but soon as fair as it ever was." He set a hand proudly on Taran's shoulder. "My son and I, we will make it so." "I had thought," Taran began slowly, "I had hoped you would return with us to Caer Dallben. Coll and Dulbin will welcome you. The farm is rich, and can be richer still if you help us with your labor. Here, the land may be worn out past restoring." "How then?" Craddock answered, his features growing stern. "Leave my land? To be another's servant? Now, when there is hope for us at last?" His eyes filled with pain as he looked at Taran. "My son," he said quietly, "you do not say all that is in your heart, nor have I said all that is in mine. My happiness blinded me to the truth. Your life has been too long apart from me. Caer Dallben is your home, more than this may ever be. This wasteland, this fallow ground, and the master of it a cripple. The herdsman had not raised his voice, but the words echoed in Taran's ears. Craddock's face had gone hard as stone, and a terrible pride flamed in his eyes. I cannot ask you to share this, nor beg duty from a son who is stranger to me. We have met. We shall part, if that is your wish. Go your own path. I do not keep you from it. Before Taran could answer, Craddock turned and made his way to the sheepfold. What must I do? Taran cried in dismay to the bard. Fluter shook his head. He'll not leave here, that's for certain. It's easy enough to see where your stubborn streak comes from. No, he won't budge, but if you would set your mind at rest, then you yourself might go to Caer Dallben. Find out the truth from Dallben. He alone can tell you. Winter would be upon us before I could return, Taran answered. He gazed at the harsh land and desolate cottage. My father is at the end of his strength. The tasks are long. They must begin now, and be done before the first snowfall. He said no more for a time. Fluter waited silently. Gurgi was quiet, his brow wrinkled with concern. Taran looked at the two, and his heart ached. Hear me well, my friends, he said slowly. Fluter, if you are willing, ride to Caer Dallben. Tell that my search is ended, and how this has come to be. As for me, my place must be here. Great Peelin, you mean to stay in this wilderness? Fluter cried, even though you doubt? Taran nodded. My doubts may be my own making. One way or another, I pray you send word speedily to me. But Elenwy must be told nothing of this, only that my quest is over. My father found. His voice faltered. Craddock needs my help. His livelihood and his life depend on it, and I will not withhold it from him. But to have Elenwy know I am a herdsman's son... No! He burst out. That would be more than I could bear. Bid her my farewell. She and I must never meet again. It were better the princess forget the shepherd boy. Better that all of you forget me. He turned to Gurgi. And you, best of good friends, ride with Fluter. If my place is here, yours must be in a happier one. Kindly master, Gurgi shouted, flinging his arms desperately about Taran. Gurgi stays, so he promised. Call me master no more, Taran bitterly flung back. No master am I, but a low-born churl. Do you long for wisdom? You will not find it here with me. Take your freedom. This valley is no beginning, but an ending. No, no, Gurgi does not listen, shouted Gurgi, clapping his hands over his ears. He threw himself flat on the ground and lay stiff as a poker. He does not go from side of kindly master. No, no, not with pullings and pushings, not with naggings and draggings. So be it, Taran said at last, seeing nothing else would sway the determined creature. When Craddock returned, Taran told him only that he and his companion would stay, and that Fluter could no longer delay his own journey. When Lion was ready to travel, Taran put his arms about the cat's mighty shoulders, and pressed his cheek into her deep fur as she mewed unhappily. Silently, he and Fluter clasped hands, and he watched while the bard, with many a backward glance, rode slowly from the valley. Leaving Melonlas and the pony tethered in the shed, Taran and Gurgi bore the saddlebags, holding their few possessions into the tumble-down cottage. Taran stood a moment, looking at the crumbling walls of the narrow chamber, the dead fire and the broken hearthstone. From the pasture, Craddock was calling to him. And so, Taran murmured, and so we have come home. In the weeks that followed, Taran believed he could have fared no worse had Morda done as he had threatened. Tall gray summits rose about him like the unyielding bars of a cage. Prisoner, he sought freedom from his memories in the harsh toil of the long days. There was much to be done. Indeed, there was all to be done. The land to clear, the cottage to repair, the sheep to tend. At first he had dreaded the dawns that brought him, weary as if he had not slept from the straw pallet by the earth to the seemingly endless labor awaiting him. But soon he rediscovered, as Kull had taught him long ago, that he could force himself to plunge into it as into an icy stream, and find refreshment even in his exhaustion. With Gurgi and Craddock, he strained and sweated to uproot boulders from the field and haul them to the cottage, where they would later serve to mend the walls. The spring where the sheep watered had dwindled to a slow trickle. Taran saw a way to unblock it, shore up the damp ground, and dig a channel, which he lined with flat stones. As the sparkling stream rushed into its new course, Taran, forgetting all else, knelt and drank of it from his cupped hands. The cool draught filled him with wonder, as though never he had tasted water until now. One day the three set about burning away the overgrowth and thorns. Taran's portion of the field took flame too slowly, and he pressed his way to thrust his torch deeper amid the brambles. As he did, a sudden gust of wind turned the fire against him. Quickly he drew back, but the thorns caught at his jacket. He stumbled and fell, crying out as the flames rose in a scarlet wave. Gurgi, at some distance, heard the shout. Craddock, seeing Taran's plight, swung about on his crutch, and even before Gurgi could reach him, flung himself to Taran's side. The herdsman dropped to the ground, and, shielding Taran with his body, seized him by the belt and dragged him clear. Where Taran had been trapped, the flaming thorns roared and crackled. The herdsman, gasping with the effort, climbed painfully to his feet. Though Taran was unscathed, the fire had seared Craddock's brow and hands. But the herdsman grinned, clapped Taran on the shoulder, saying with rough affection, "I have not found a son only to lose him," and with no more ado, went back to his work. "My thanks to you," Taran called, but in his voice there was as much bitterness as gratitude. For the man who had saved his life was the same man who had broken it. Thus it was in the days that followed. When the sheep sickened, Craddock cared for it with an unexpected tenderness that went to Taran's heart. Yet Craddock it was who had torn asunder Taran's dream of noble birth and destroyed every single hope he had cherished for Elodie. When danger threatened the flock, Craddock turned fierce as a wolf, heedless of his own safety, with a courage Taran could only admire. Yet this man held him prisoner, in fetters of blood right. Craddock would touch no food until Taran and Gurgi had their fill, and often went hungry as a result, all the while insisting his appetite was dull. Yet the gift stuck in Taran's throat, and he scorned the generosity he would have honored in any other man. "Are there two herdsmen in this valley?" Taran cried to himself. "One I can only love, and one I can only hate." So passed the summer. To forget the anguish of his divided heart, Taran labored for the sake of the labor itself. Many tasks were still to be done, and the flock always to be tended. Until now, Craddock had been hard-pressed to keep the new lambs from straying, and, as the sheep roved farther afield seeking better pasture, to gather all into the fold at evening. Gurgi pleaded to be given charge of them, and the flock seemed as pleased as he was. He gamboled happily with the lambs, clucked and fussed over the ewes, and even the ancient bad-tempered ram turned gentle in his presence. As the days grew cooler, Craddock gave him a jacket of unshorn fleece, and as Gurgi moved among his charges, Taran could hardly distinguish the shaggy creature bundled in his woolly garb from the rest of the flock. Often Taran came upon him sitting on a boulder, the sheep in an admiring circle around their guardian. They followed him everywhere, and would even have trotted after him into the cottage. Marching at the head of the flock, Gurgi looked as proud as a war leader. "See with lookings!" Gurgi shouted. "See them heed Gurgi with bleatings. Is kindly master assistant pig-keeper? Then bold, clever Gurgi is now assistant sheep-keeper." But Taran's eyes still turned beyond the barrier of the hills. At the end of each day he scanned the passes for a sign of Fluter, and the clouds for a glimpse of Caw. The crow, he feared, had flown to the lake of Lunette. Not finding the companions there, Caw might be waiting for them still, or, impatient, be seeking them elsewhere. As for the bard, Taran sensed more than ever that Fluter would not return, and as the days shortened and autumn drew closer, he gave up his vigil and looked no longer at the sky. Chapter 15. The Open Cage. Throughout summer and fall, the three had worked unstintingly to finish the cottage, their only refuge against the oncoming winter. Now as the first snow whirled from the heavy sky to powder the crags with dry, white flakes, it was done. The walls of new stone rose firm and solid. The roof had been thatched anew, and tightly chinked against wind and weather. Within, a fire cheerily blazed in the new hearth. The wooden benches had been mended. The door no longer sagged on broken hinges. Though Craddock had given himself unsparingly to the toil, the cottage was, for the most part, Taran's labor. The rusted tools sharpened and refurbished served him to make what other tools he needed. The planning as well as the doing had been his, and as he stood in the dooryard, the fine snow clinging like chaff to his uncropped hair, it was not without pride that he watched the smoke rising from the rebuilt chimney. Craddock had come to stand beside him, and the herdsman put a hand fondly on Taran's shoulder. For a time neither spoke, but at last Craddock said, "For all the years I strove to keep what was mine, it is mine no longer." His bearded face furrowed in a smile. "Ours," he said. Taran nodded, but made no further answer. Since the winter tasks were short, the brief days seemed longer, evenings by the fire to while away the time. Craddock told of his youth, of his settling in the valley. As the herdsman spoke of his hopes and hardships, Taran's admiration quickened, and for the first time he saw Craddock as a man who had been not unlike himself. Thus, at Craddock's urging, Taran was willing to tell of his days at Caerdalban, and all that had befallen him. Craddock's face brightened with fatherly pride as he heard of these adventures. Yet often Taran would stop in the midst of his recounting when memories of Elenwy, and all his life-long past, would surge suddenly and break upon him like a wave. Then would he break off abruptly, turn his face away, and stare at the fire. Those times Craddock pressed him to speak no further. A bond of affection, born of their common toil, had grown among all three. Craddock never failed to treat Gurgey with much kindness and gentleness, and the creature, more than ever pleased with his duties as shepherd, was well content. But once, at the beginning of winter, Craddock spoke apart with Taran, saying, "Since the day you have come to dwell here, I have called you my son, yet never have you called me father." Taran bit his lips. At one time he had yearned to shout aloud his bitterness, to fling it angrily at the herdsman's face. It still tormented him. But now he could not bring himself to wound the feelings of one he scorned as a father, yet honored as a man. Seeing Taran's distress, Craddock nodded briefly. "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps one day you shall." Snow turned the gray summits glistening white, yet the tall peaks Taran once had seen as bars now shielded the valley from the brunt of the storms, and against the wolf wind howling through the ice-bound passages, the cottage stood fast. Late of an afternoon, when Craddock and Gurgey had gone to see to the flock, the gale sharpened and Taran set about stretching a heavier sheepskin across the narrow window. He had only begun when the door was flung open as though ripped from its hinges. Shouting frantically, Gurgey burst into the cottage. "Help! Help! Kindly master, come with hastenings!" Gurgey's face was pale as ashes. His hands shook violently as he clutched at Taran's arm. "Master, master, follow Gurgey! Quickly! Oh, quickly!" Taran dropped the sheepskin, hurriedly donning a fleece jacket, and, as Gurgey moaned and wrung his hands, snatched up a cloak and raced through the front door. Taran dropped the sheepskin, hurriedly donned a fleece jacket, and, as Gurgey moaned and wrung his hands, snatched up a cloak and raced through the open door. Outside, the wind caught at him and nearly flung him backward. Gurgey pressed on, wildly waving his arms. Taran bent forward against the gale and ran beside his desperate companion, stumbling across the snow-swept field. At the edge of the pasture they had cleared during the summer, the land fell sharply away into stony slopes, and he followed closely behind Gurgey as the creature scrambled past a rocky draw, then along a twisting path where he soon halted. Taran gasped in dismay as Gurgey, whimpering fearfully, pointed downward. A narrow ledge jutted from the sheer side of the gorge. A figure, arms outflung, lay motionless, one leg twisted under his body, partly covered with fallen stones. It was Craddock. "Gone with stumblings," Gurgey moaned. "Oh, miserable Gurgey could not save him from slippings." He clapped his hands to his head. Too late for helpings. Taran's head spun with shock. Grief struck him like a sword. But then, beyond his will, terrifying in a sudden onrush, a wild sense of freedom flooded him as though rising from the most hidden depths of his heart. In one dizzying glance, he seemed to see his cage of stone crumble. The still form on the ledge stirred painfully and lifted an arm. "He lives!" Taran cried. "Oh, master, how do we save him?" Gurgi wailed. "Terrible crags are steep. Even bold Gurgi fears to climb down." "Is there no way?" Taran exclaimed. "He's badly hurt, dying perhaps. We cannot leave him." He pressed his fist to his reeling forehead. "Even if we could make our way to him, how could we bear him up? And if we fail, not one life lost, but 3. His hands were shaking. It was not despair that filled him, but terror. Black terror at the thoughts whispering in his mind. Was there the slimmest hope of saving the stricken herdsman? If not, even Prince Gwydion would not reproach Taran's decision. Nor would any man. Instead, they would grieve with him at his loss. Free of his burden, free of the valley, the door of his cage opened wide, and all his life awaited him. Elenwy, Caer Dallben. He seemed to hear his own voice speak these words, and he listened in shame and horror. Then, as if his heart would burst with it, he cried out in a terrible rage, "What man am I?" Blind with fury at himself, he sprang down the slope, and clawed for a handhold amid the ice-covered stones, while Gurgi, panting fearfully, clambered after him. Taran's numbed fingers clutched vainly at an outcropping as a rock gave way beneath his feet. Downward he pitched, and cried out as a jagged stone drove against his chest. Black suns burst in his head, and he choked with pain. Above, Gurgi was sliding down in a shower of ice and pebbles. Taran's heart pounded. He was on the ledge. Craddock lay within arm's reach. Taran crawled to his side. Blood streamed down Craddock's brow as the herdsman struggled to raise his head. "Son, son," he gasped, "you have lost your life for me." "Not so," Taran answered. "Don't try to move. We'll find a way to bring you to safety." He raised himself to his knees. Craddock was even more grievously hurt than Taran had feared. Carefully, he lifted away the heavy stones and shale that had pressed against the herdsman, and gently drew him closer to the protecting face of the cliff. Gurgi had dropped to the ledge and scurried to join Taran. "Master, master!" he cried. "Gurgi sees a pathway upward, but it is steep. Oh, steep, with dangers of hurtful stumblings and tumblings!" Taran glanced at where the creature pointed. Amid the rocks and snow-filled crevices, he could make out a narrow passageway, free of ice. Yet, as Gurgi had warned, it rose nearly straight up. One man at a time could scale it. But what of 2, burdened with a 3rd? He gritted his teeth. The sharp stone had wounded him sorely as a blade, and each breath he drew filled his lungs with fire. He gestured for Gurgi to lay hold of Craddock's legs, while he edged unsteadily along the sheer drop, and slid his hands under the herdsman's shoulders. As gently as the companions strove to lift him, Craddock cried out in agony, and they were forced to halt, fearful their efforts would do more harm to him. A wind had risen, screaming through the valley, lashing at the companions and nearly tearing them from the ledge. Once more they struggled to bear Craddock to the upward passage, and once more fell back as the gale battered them. The early twilight had begun deepening, and shadows filled the gorge. The face of the cliff wavered before Taran's eyes. His legs trembled as he forced himself again to lift the herdsman. "Leave me," Craddock murmured hoarsely. "Leave me, you waste your own strength." "Leave you?" Taran burst out. "What son forsakes his own flesh and blood?" Hearing this, Craddock smiled for an instant, and then his face grew taut in anguish. "Save yourselves," he whispered. "You are my father," Taran replied. "I stay." "No," the herdsman cried out with all his strength. "Do as I ask and go from here. Heed me now, or it will be too late. The duty of kinship? You owe me none. No bond of blood holds you." "How then?" Taran gasped, staring wildly at the herdsman. His head spun, and he clutched at the ledge. "How then? Do you tell me I am not your son?" Craddock looked at him a moment, his eyes unwavering. "Never have I been false to any man, save once, to you." "A lie?" Taran stammered in dismay. Did you lie to me then, or do you lie to me now? Half-truth is worse than lie, Craddock answered brokenly. Hear me, hear this part of the truth. Yes, long past, as he journeyed through Prydain, Dolben sheltered with me, but of what he sought he never spoke. The child, Taran cried. There was none? There was, Craddock answered. A son, our firstborn. Even as I told you, he did not live beyond the day of his birth. His mother died with him, he murmured. And you, I needed your strength to keep what remained to me. I saw no other way. Even as I spoke the lie, I was ashamed, then more ashamed to speak the truth. When your companion left, I could only hope that you would follow with him and gave you freedom to do so. You chose to stay. But this, as well, is true, Craddock said hurriedly. At first I leaned upon you as on my crutch, because you served my need. But no father came to love a son more dearly. Taran's head sank to his breast. He could not speak, and his tears blinded him. Craddock, who had half raised himself, fell back to the stones of the ledge. Go from here, he murmured. Taran's hand dropped to his side. His fingers touched the rim of the battle horn. With a sudden cry, he straightened. Ellenwy's horn. Unthinking, he had slung it about his shoulder when he had ran from the cottage. Hastily, he drew it from beneath his cloak. The summons to the fair folk, the call he had treasured. It alone could save Craddock. He stumbled to his feet. The ledge seemed to sway beneath him. The notes Dolly had taught him blurred in his mind, and he strove desperately to recall them. Suddenly they rang once more in his memory. He raised the horn to his lips. The notes sprang loud and clear, and even before the signal faded, the wind caught them and seemed to fling the call all through the valley, where it returned in echo after echo. Then whirling shadows engulfed him, and Taran dropped to the ledge. How long they clung there he did not know. Whether moments or hours, he was only dimly aware of strong hands bearing him up, of a rope lashed about his waist. He glimpsed vaguely, as between the flickerings of a dark flame, the broad faces of dwarvish mountaineers, whose number he could not judge. When next he opened his eyes, he was in the cottage, the fire blazing, Gurgi beside him. Taran started up. Pain seared his chest, which he saw had been carefully bandaged. The signal, he murmured feebly. It was answered? Yes, yes, Gurgi cried. Fair folk save us, with mighty haulings and heavings. They bind up kindly masters' hurtful wounds, and leave healing herbs for all that is needed. The summons, Taran began. Good old Dolly, he warned me not to waste it. For Craddock's sake, I'm glad I kept it as long as I did. Craddock, where is he? How does he fare? He stopped suddenly. Gurgi was looking at him silently. The creature's face wrinkled miserably, and tears stood in his eyes as he bowed his shaggy head. Taran fell back. His own cry of anguish rang in his ears. Beyond that was only darkness. This concludes Chapter 15. Thank you for listening. And remember, have a good day. You deserve it.